Sorry, sir, but I can't authorize treatment without proper insurance verification, the hospital administrator stated coldly, her eyes never leaving her computer screen. She blocked access to the emergency room doors, effectively barring the middle-aged man who stood before her, grimacing in pain. James Mercer just nodded slightly, his eyes betraying a flicker of desperation before settling back into quiet resignation. "There must be some mistake," he murmured, clutching his side where the pain radiated outward. Seconds later, the sterile calm of the hospital lobby shattered. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." James Mercer, known as Jim to his few close friends, was 58 years old, though the deep lines etched across his weathered face and the pronounced limp in his gait told the story of a much harder journey than most men his age had endured. He lived alone in a modest cabin on the outskirts of Pinecrest, a small coastal town in Oregon where the forest met the sea. His existence was simple, surviving on his military pension and occasional work as a woodcarver, selling intricate handmade pieces to tourists during the summer months. He rarely spoke of his past, maintaining a polite but distant relationship with the townspeople. Most knew him only as the quiet man who sometimes helped at the local Veterans Support Center, offering silent assistance rather than conversation. A man more comfortable with actions than words. Few knew the truth of who he had been, what he had done, or what he had sacrificed. Jim preferred it that way, finding peace in anonymity after decades of operating in shadows. His most valuable possessions weren't displayed on his walls or shelves. They remained carefully stored in a fireproof lockbox beneath the floorboards of his cabin, a collection of classified mission reports with names and locations redacted, photographs of men whose faces would never appear in history books, and a small, unassuming silver trident pin that spoke volumes to those who recognized its significance. These were the remnants of a life he had mostly put behind him, tangible connections to brothers who understood what it meant to serve in the most demanding unit in the Navy. Jim spent most Thursdays volunteering at the Veterans Center, not counseling or leading groups, but simply being present, fixing broken furniture, maintaining the grounds, listening when someone needed an ear that understood. It was his way of honoring promises made long ago to men who never made it home, a quiet commitment to service that continued long after his official duties had ended. Today was different. Today, the stabbing pain that had been building in his abdomen for weeks had finally become unbearable. Jim wasn't one to complain about discomfort. He'd been trained to endure far worse. But when he collapsed while chopping wood that morning, even he recognized it was time to seek help. He'd driven himself to Pinecrest Memorial Hospital, the only medical facility within 50 miles, arriving just as the afternoon shift change was underway. The pain had intensified during the drive, radiating from his lower right side throughout his entire torso, causing cold sweat to bead on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. He knew the signs: possible appendicitis, perhaps something worse. Either way, it required immediate attention. Jim had parked haphazardly near the emergency entrance, one hand pressed firmly against his side as he made his way through the sliding glass doors into the sterile white lobby. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The emergency room was surprisingly quiet for a Thursday afternoon. A few patients sat scattered across uncomfortable plastic chairs, a mother cradling a feverish child, an elderly man with a bandaged hand, a teenager with what appeared to be a sports injury. A television mounted in the corner played a daytime talk show that nobody seemed to be watching, the host's enthusiastic voice creating a jarring contrast to the atmosphere of quiet suffering. Jim approached the intake desk, where a young woman in purple scrubs was engrossed in conversation with The hospital administrator, Diane Keller. Ms. Keller was new to Pinecrest, having arrived from a large hospital system in Seattle just 3 months prior. She'd quickly developed a reputation in the small town for her rigid adherence to protocol and cost-cutting measures. Efficiency over empathy, as the local doctor had once remarked privately. "Excuse me," Jim said, his voice tight with pain. "I need to see a doctor. I think it might be my appendix." The nurse looked up immediately, concern crossing her face as she took in Jim's pallor and the way he hunched protectively over his right side. But before she could respond, Ms. Keller stepped forward, positioning herself between Jim and the check-in computer. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone professionally detached. "We'll need to get your information first. Insurance card and ID, please." Jim reached for his wallet with shaking hands, the movement sending another wave of pain through his abdomen. "I have my VA card," he said, sliding the identification across the counter. "I'm a veteran, should cover emergency services." Miss Keller picked up the card, examining it with a slight frown. "Veterans Affairs," she murmured, turning to the computer. She typed rapidly, her long manicured nails clicking against the keyboard. "I'm not seeing you in our system, Mr. Mercer. Are you registered with our hospital network?" "No," Jim replied, a fresh wave of pain causing him to grip the counter. "I haven't needed to come here before, but the VA coverage should—" "I understand," Ms. Keller interrupted, her tone suggesting she didn't understand at all. "However, we have protocols for VA patients. We need prior authorization for non-service-connected emergencies." She glanced at him critically. "Is this condition related to your service?" Jim stared at her, bewildered by the question, while fighting through another surge of pain. I don't know. It's my appendix. How would that be service-connected?" The nurse behind the counter looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ms. Keller, perhaps we should get him triaged first and sort out the paperwork after—" "Sarah, you know the new policies," Ms. Keller cut her off sharply. "We've had too many cases of unreimbursed care. The hospital board was very clear about following proper authorization procedures." She turned back to Jim. "Sir, without prior VA approval or proof of private insurance, I can only offer you care on a self-pay basis. We would need a deposit of $3,500 before treatment." Jim's face paled further, though not from pain. "I don't have that kind of money on hand. Can't you just call the VA and confirm my coverage?" "It's after hours at the regional VA office," Ms. Keller replied, glancing at her watch. "Their authorization department closed at 4. You're welcome to contact them in the morning, or drive to the VA hospital in Portland." "Portland is 3 hours away," Jim said, his voice tightening as another spasm hit. "I don't think I can make that drive." Several patients in the waiting area had begun to take notice of the exchange, casting concerned glances toward the intake. A desk. The mother with the sick child whispered something to the elderly man beside her, who shook his head in disapproval. "Perhaps you have a credit card?" Ms. Keller suggested, her voice lowering slightly. "We can put a hold on it for the estimated charges." Jim shook his head. "I don't use credit cards." He straightened up with effort, dignity reasserting itself through the pain. "Look, I understand you have policies, but this is an emergency. I've served this country for 27 years. I've earned my medical benefits." Ms. Keller's expression hardened slightly. "Many people have served, Mr. Mercer, but I still have to follow hospital protocols. Perhaps you could contact a family member who might help with the deposit." The humiliation was quiet but potent, wrapping around Jim like the pain that now seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. He had no family to call, no wife, no children, no siblings still living. His family had been his team, his unit, men scattered across the country or buried beneath white stones in military cemeteries. "I don't have family nearby," he said simply, the admission costing him almost as much as the physical pain. Sarah, the nurse, looked increasingly distressed, Miss Keller, I really think we should— Sarah, please prepare the self-pay forms, Miss Keller interrupted firmly. She turned back to Jim, her expression professionally neutral, but her tone leaving no room for argument. I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer, but without insurance verification or a deposit, I cannot authorize emergency treatment beyond a basic assessment. Those are the rules. Jim didn't argue further. Decades of military discipline had taught him when battles couldn't be won through frontal assault. He stepped back from the counter, one hand still pressed against his side, the other gripping his VA card that had proven useless in this moment of need. He moved toward the waiting area, finding an empty chair near the corner. The pain was becoming more consistent now, less in waves, and more a steady, throbbing pressure that made it difficult to think clearly. He considered his options. Driving to Portland seemed impossible in his current state. Perhaps he could call someone from the Veterans Center, though most would be gone by this hour. Jim sat quietly, his breathing measured and controlled the way he'd been taught decades ago to manage pain. The technique helped, but only marginally. He watched as Ms. Keller efficiently processed other patients, those with private insurance or the ability to pay moving smoothly through the system. An orderly occasionally glanced his way with concern, but no one approached. The minutes stretched into an hour. Jim remained in his chair, growing paler, his shirt now damp with sweat despite the aggressive air conditioning. A few patients who had arrived after him were already being called back for treatment. The mother with the sick child caught his eye as she was escorted through the double doors, her expression a mix of sympathy and helplessness. Sarah, the nurse, approached during a lull, kneeling beside his chair. "Mr. Mercer," she whispered, "I'm so sorry about this. Miss Keller is very strict about the new policies. The hospital was acquired by a larger healthcare group last year, and they've implemented all these rules." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "I can get you some water, maybe some over-the-counter pain medication?" Jim nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he managed, his voice strained. "Water would be good." As Sarah hurried away, Jim noticed Miss Keller watching them, her expression disapproving. When the nurse returned with a paper cup of water and 2 white pills, she placed them in Jim's hand quickly, almost furtively. "It's just Tylenol," she explained apologetically. "It won't help much, but it's something. I'm trying to reach Dr. Lawrence. He's been at this hospital for 30 years and might be able to override the policy, but he's in surgery right now." Jim thanked her again, swallowing the pills with a grimace. They both knew it was woefully inadequate for what was happening inside his body, but it was all the help she could offer, without risking her job. The afternoon wore on. The waiting room gradually emptied and filled again as the early evening rush began. Minor injuries from after-school sports, workplace accidents, the regular rhythm of a community's medical needs. Jim remained in his corner, increasingly isolated in his suffering, too proud to plead and too disciplined to create a scene. At 6:47 p.m., the sliding glass doors of the emergency entrance whispered open. Jim, drifting between clarity and a pain-induced. Hayes barely registered the new arrivals at first. 4 men entered the lobby, moving with a synchronized precision that would have been immediately familiar to Jim had he been more alert. They weren't in uniform. They wore civilian clothes ranging from business casual to simple jeans and T-shirts, but they carried themselves with an unmistakable bearing that set them apart from ordinary civilians. The leader of the group, a tall man with close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair and the build of someone who remained combat-ready despite being well into his 40s, scanned the waiting room with practiced efficiency. His gaze swept over the intake, a desk, the scattered patients, and then stopped abruptly when it reached Jim's hunched figure in the corner. Commander Nathan "Nate" Reeves had retired from active duty 3 years ago after 22 years of distinguished service in the Navy's most elite unit. He now ran a private security consulting firm with offices in Seattle and San Diego, staffed almost exclusively with former special operators. Today, He was in Pinecrest by coincidence, or perhaps something more than coincidence, for a rare team reunion at a lakeside cabin owned by one of their former teammates. The three men with him were from his last operational unit: Michael Chen, former Chief Petty Officer and Communications Specialist; Derek Washington, a former hospital corpsman with advanced medical training; and James Rodriguez, a weapons specialist whose hands could be equally skilled at disarming explosives or playing classical guitar. Recognition flashed across Commander Reeves's face as he identified Jim Mercer in the corner. Recognition, then. Concern, then something harder as he took in Jim's obvious distress and isolated position. He changed direction immediately, his team automatically adjusting their movement to follow his lead without needing verbal instruction. Ms. Keller, noticing the purposeful approach of four fit, serious-looking men, straightened behind the intake desk, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her otherwise composed features. "Jim?" Commander Reeves said as he reached the chair, dropping to one knee to bring himself to eye level with the suffering man. "Jim Mercer, what's going on, brother?" Jim looked up, momentarily confused, then clarity broke through the pain. "Nate," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "Lake House reunion," Nate replied briefly, his tactical assessment of Jim's condition already complete. "More importantly, what's happening with you? You look like hell." Derek Washington was already moving to Jim's other side, his corpsman's training evident as he checked Jim's pulse and noted his symptoms. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked, his tone professional, but with an undercurrent of controlled anger. "Couple hours," Jim admitted. "They won't treat me without insurance verification or a cash deposit." The four men exchanged glances, a silent communication honed through years of high-stakes operations where words were often unnecessary. Nate stood, turning toward the intake, desk with purpose in every step. Ms. Keller watched his approach with growing apprehension, straightening her blazer as if preparing for confrontation. The other patients in the waiting area sensed the shift in atmosphere, conversations quieting as attention turned to the unfolding scene. "Ma'am," Commander Reeves began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that had once commanded men through situations where failure meant death. "The man sitting in your waiting area requires immediate medical attention. He's displaying clear signs of acute appendicitis, possibly with perforation given the duration of symptoms." Ms. Keller's professional mask remained firmly in place. "Sir, I understand your concern, but if you're referring to Mr. Mercer, we've already explained our policy regarding—" "The man you're forcing to sit in agony," Nate interrupted, his voice still measured but carrying an edge that made several nearby staff members freeze in place, "is Senior Chief Petty Officer James Mercer, retired. He served 27 years as a Navy SEAL, completing 11 combat deployments and earning 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a Purple Heart." A hushed silence fell across the lobby. Even the television seemed to have quieted, though in reality it continued its cheerful programming, now an inappropriate soundtrack to the tension unfolding below. "Sir," Ms. Keller began again, her voice slightly less certain, "while we respect Mr. Mercer's service, our policies regarding insurance verification apply to everyone. We cannot make exceptions based on military background." Nate leaned forward slightly, not in a threatening manner, but with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to having his words taken seriously. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for special treatment because of his military background. I'm telling you that you are currently denying urgent care to a veteran with clear symptoms of a life-threatening condition who has valid VA coverage that you're refusing to verify through appropriate channels." Ms. Keller's expression tightened, her professional demeanor hardening into defensive rigidity. "Sir, I understand you may have personal connections with Mr. Mercer, but hospital policy is very clear. without proper insurance verification or payment, we cannot provide non-emergency treatment. If you believe this is a true emergency, you're welcome to call an ambulance service. Derek Washington, the former corpsman, joined Nate at the counter, his medical expertise adding weight to their position. Mum, I have extensive medical training, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this man is experiencing a serious medical emergency. His symptoms indicate possible appendicitis with signs of peritonitis. Delayed treatment could be fatal. Are you a licensed physician with admitting privileges at this hospital? Ms. Keller challenged, her tone growing increasingly defensive. No, ma'am, Derek replied evenly, but I've treated similar conditions in combat zones across 3 continents. I know what I'm seeing. Ms. Keller straightened, sensing she was losing control of the situation. Then I suggest you understand your limitations in this environment. This is a medical facility with established protocols, not a battlefield. The dismissal of Derek's expertise that had saved countless lives under the most extreme conditions imaginable, sent a visible ripple through the 4 men. Michael Chen, the communications specialist, stepped forward, his approach more diplomatic. Ms. Keller, he said, having noted her name from the desk placard, we respect hospital protocols, but surely there must be a way to verify Mr. Mercer's VA eligibility, perhaps through an emergency contact number or a provider portal that your staff can access. Our system doesn't interface directly with VA records after hours, she responded, though her certainty seemed to waver slightly. And as I explained to Mr. Mercer, the regional authorization office is closed until tomorrow morning. Rodriguez, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Ma'am, with all due respect, that doesn't sound like a limitation of possibility, but one of convenience. The VA has 24-hour services for precisely these situations. Several patients in the waiting area had begun to watch the exchange with increasing interest and concern. An elderly man with a cane who had been quietly waiting, his turn stood up and approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of a man who had once been accustomed to command. "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm Dr. Harold Bennett, retired. I practiced medicine for 40 years, including a stint as chief of surgery at Portland General." He glanced toward Jim, his experienced eye taking in the symptoms. "That man needs immediate medical attention. I'd stake my reputation on it." Ms. Keller looked increasingly cornered. "Sir, with all due respect to your experience, you're not credentialed at this facility. We have procedures." "Young lady," Dr. Bennett interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, "I've been coming to this hospital for my own care since before you were born. I understand procedures. I also understand the Hippocratic Oath and medical ethics. That man needs treatment now, not after paperwork is processed." A small crowd had begun to gather. Other patients, a janitor who had paused his mopping, 2 nurses who had emerged from behind the security doors. Sarah, the intake nurse who had tried to help Jim earlier, stepped forward. "Ms. Keller," she said, her voice quiet but determined, "Dr. Lawrence is out of surgery now. I've paged him about the situation." Ms. Keller's face flushed with anger. "You went over my head? Sarah, we'll discuss this breach of protocol later." She turned back to Commander Reeves and his team. "Gentlemen, I understand your concern for your friend, but I must insist you stop disrupting our emergency department. If you continue, I'll have no choice but to call security." Nate's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, a calmness that those who had served with him recognized as the prelude to decisive action, not escalation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now deliberately quiet, forcing everyone to listen more carefully. "I'd like to be absolutely clear about something. We're not here to cause a disruption. We're here because a man who has bled for this country is being denied medical care he has earned and deserves." He paused, ensuring his next words would register fully. "Jim Mercer saved my life in Afghanistan. In 2008, he carried me 3 miles through hostile territory with a bullet in his own leg after our unit was ambushed. He didn't stop to check if I had insurance or if the proper paperwork had been filed. He simply did what was right." The lobby had gone completely silent. Even Ms. Keller seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "Now," Nate continued, "we can resolve this situation in one of 2 ways. You can provide the medical care he needs immediately, and we can sort out the paperwork afterward. Or you can continue to hide behind policy while a decorated veteran suffers needlessly." He reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone. "If you choose the second option, I should inform you that I have the direct number for the VA Secretary's emergency line, the personal cell phone of 2 United States senators who serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and contacts at 3 major news networks who would find this situation very newsworthy." Rodriguez stepped closer, adding casually, "I also have 17,000 followers on Twitter who really hate stories about veterans being denied medical care. Just saying." Miss Keller's composure finally cracked. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all," Nate replied calmly. "I'm simply explaining the choices available and their likely consequences. That's not a threat, it's a reality assessment, something we're trained to provide." Just as the tension reached its peak, the double doors to the treatment area swung open. A tall, distinguished man in surgical scrubs stepped into the lobby, his expression concerned as he took in the scene. The name embroidered on his white coat read, "Dr. Lawrence, Chief of Emergency Medicine." "What's happening out here?" he asked, his gaze moving from Ms. Keller to the group of men to Jim still hunched in the corner chair. "I got a page about a patient in distress." Sarah stepped forward quickly. "Dr. Lawrence, this is Mr. Mercer. He came in hours ago with symptoms consistent with appendicitis, but there was an issue with his VA coverage verification." Dr. Lawrence's expression darkened as he quickly crossed to Jim, kneeling to perform a brief examination. After checking his pulse and palpating his abdomen, causing Jim to wince sharply, he stood and turned to Ms. Keller. "This man needs surgery immediately," he stated flatly. "How long has he been waiting?" "Approximately 3 hours, Doctor," Sarah answered when Ms. Keller hesitated. "His pain has been intensifying, and he's showing signs of fever now." Dr. Lawrence's professional calm barely contained his obvious anger. 3 hours with acute appendicitis symptoms. Ms. Keller, what possible justification? "The new financial clearance protocols," she began defensively. "He doesn't have insurance verification or the required deposit." "I don't give a damn about financial clearance protocols when a patient is in this condition," Dr. Lawrence cut her off, his voice low but intense. "Get a gurney out here now, and Prepper 2, page Dr. Wilson for anesthesia." Miss Keller stood frozen, caught between hospital policy and medical necessity. "Sir, the administration has been very clear about the financial procedures. My position—" "Your position," Dr. Lawrence interrupted, "will be a lot more precarious if this man suffers complications because of delayed treatment. Medical necessity overrides financial procedures. Always." He turned to Sarah. "If Miss Keller won't call for a gurney, please do so immediately." Sarah practically ran to the phone at the desk, relief evident in her quick movements. Dr. Lawrence turned to Nate and his team. "Are you friends of Mr. Mercer?" "Yes, sir," Nate responded. "Former teammates." Understanding flashed across the doctor's face. "Military?" "Navy," Nate confirmed simply. Dr. Lawrence nodded. No further explanation needed. "We'll take good care of him. His appendix may have already ruptured given the duration of symptoms, but we'll do everything possible." Within minutes, 2 orderlies arrived with a gurney. Derek and Rodriguez helped ease Jim onto it, the movement causing him to grimace in pain despite his efforts to remain stoic. "Hang in there, brother," Derek murmured. "You're in good hands now." As they prepared to wheel Jim through the double doors, he reached out and grasped Nate's wrist with surprising strength. "Thank you," he whispered, "but don't cause trouble on my account." Nate smiled slightly. "Too late for that, Senior Chief. Just focus on getting better." Dr. Lawrence began issuing rapid instructions as they moved toward the treatment area. "Start IV antibiotics, broad spectrum. Get a CBC metabolic panel and prep for emergency appendectomy. I want him in the OR in the next 20 minutes." As the doors swung closed behind them, the remaining 3 SEALs turned their attention back to Ms. Keller, who stood rigidly behind the intake desk, her expression a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. "This isn't over," she stated, attempting to reassert her authority. "Someone will need to address the financial responsibility for this procedure. The hospital cannot simply provide free care because of military connections or public pressure." "No one is asking for free care," Michael replied calmly. "Jim has earned his VA benefits through 27 years of service. The issue isn't the legitimacy of his coverage. It's your unwillingness to make a phone call to verify it." Rodriguez had already pulled out his phone. "Speaking of phone calls, I think it's time we reached out to some people who might be interested in this situation." Ms. Keller's expression faltered. "That won't be necessary. Now that Dr. Lawrence has made the medical determination should have been made 3 hours ago." Nate interrupted, his voice still controlled, but carrying an edge that made everyone in the vicinity pay attention. "This isn't about following procedures. This is about a fundamental failure to recognize basic human dignity and earned benefits." He stepped closer to the desk, not in a threatening manner, but with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being heard. "Ms. Keller, I understand you have a job to do. I respect that. But when policies conflict with providing care to those who have earned it, something is fundamentally broken." The elderly Dr. Bennett, who had remained nearby throughout the confrontation, nodded in agreement. "Young lady, I've watched this hospital change over the decades. When I first practiced medicine, we treated patients first and worried about payment later. Something has been lost in all this corporatization of healthcare." Ms. Keller's professional facade began to crack under the combined pressure. "Look, I don't make the policies. I just implement them. The hospital was acquired by Pinnacle Healthcare Group last year, and they've been very clear about financial protocols. My performance reviews depend on adherence to these standards." "So Jim's life was less important than your performance review?" Derek asked, his voice quiet but cutting. Before Ms. Keller could respond, the main entrance doors slid open again. A distinguished man in his 60s entered, wearing an expensive suit despite the late hour. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority, heading directly toward the gathering at the intake desk. "Ms. Keller," he called out as he approached, "I received a concerning call from Dr. Lawrence. What exactly is happening in my emergency department?" The color drained from Ms. Keller's face. "Dr. Whitman, I was just following the new financial clearance protocols for—" "Richard Whitman," the man introduced himself to Nate and the others, extending his hand. "Chief Medical Officer for Pinecrest Memorial." He glanced around at the assembled group, taking in the tension. "I understand we have a situation involving a veteran being denied care." "Senior Chief Petty Officer James Mercer," Nate explained, shaking the offered hand. "He came in with clear symptoms of appendicitis over 3 hours ago, but was denied treatment because your staff claimed they couldn't verify his VA coverage after hours." Dr. Whitman's expression darkened. "Ms. Keller, is this accurate?" I was following the new Pinnacle protocols, she repeated defensively. The policy clearly states that without verification, the policy also includes a medical necessity. Override, Dr. Whitman interrupted sharply. And even without that, we have a dedicated VA liaison line specifically for these situations. He turned to Sarah. Nurse Jenkins, please pull up the electronic record for Mr. Mercer and contact the VA emergency verification line immediately. Sarah nodded, relieved that someone with authority was finally addressing the situation properly. Yes, Doctor. Right away. Dr. Whitman turned back to Nate and his team. Gentlemen, on behalf of Pinecrest Memorial, I want to extend my sincere apologies for this situation. This is not how we treat any patient, let alone someone who has served our country. He glanced toward the treatment area. I assure you that Senior Chief Mercer is receiving the best possible care now. Dr. Lawrence is one of our finest surgeons. Nate's expression remained measured. Thank you, Dr. Whitman. Our concern isn't about the quality of your medical staff. It's about a system that places financial verification above immediate medical needs for a veteran in distress. A valid concern, Dr. Whitman acknowledged, and one I'll be addressing comprehensively. He turned to Ms. Keller, his professional, courtesy barely masking his anger. Ms. Keller, please gather your things and report to my office tomorrow morning at 9. We need to discuss your interpretation of hospital policies and your role going forward. Ms. Keller's composure finally broke completely. Dr. Whitman, I was just following the directives from Pinnacle's corporate office. They've been explicit about financial clearance before treatment. Then perhaps you should seek employment directly with Pinnacle's corporate office, Dr. Whitman replied coldly. Because that's not how medicine works at my hospital, regardless of who owns it on paper. He turned to an older nurse who had been watching the exchange. Nurse Garcia, please take over the intake desk for the remainder of the shift. Looking back at Nate and his team, he added, Gentlemen, if you'll follow me to the surgical waiting area, I'll make sure you're kept updated on Senior Chief Mercer's condition. As they followed Dr. Whitman through the double doors that had previously been barred to them, Rodriguez leaned close to Michael. Did you actually call someone? Michael smiled slightly. Sent a text to Admiral Holbrook. Figured having the former head of Naval Special Warfare Command make a call might move things along. Good call, Rodriguez murmured, though I think we had it handled. Always nice to have fire support on standby, Michael replied with the easy confidence of men accustomed to having contingency plans. The surgical waiting area was a stark contrast to the main lobby, quieter, with more comfortable seating and a coffee station in the corner. Dr. Whitman gestured for them to make themselves comfortable. The procedure should take approximately 1 hour, depending on what they find, he explained. Dr. Lawrence will come speak with you as soon as it's complete. He hesitated, then added, I want you to know that I'm a veteran myself, Army Medical Corps, 2 tours in Iraq. What happened today goes against everything I believe about how we should treat those who've served. Nate nodded in acknowledgement. We appreciate that, Doctor. The system failed today, not the individuals providing care. After Dr. Whitman departed, the 4 men settled into the waiting area, their postures relaxing slightly now that Jim was receiving treatment, but the underlying tension still evident in their alertness. Think he'll be okay? Rodriguez asked, directing the question to Derek, whose medical expertise they all respected. Derek considered for a moment. If the appendix hadn't ruptured yet, his prognosis is excellent. If it had... He shrugged. Complications are possible, but he's tough. He survived worse in Kandahar. Remember when he took that shrapnel in his shoulder during the extraction in 09? Michael asked, a slight smile playing at his lips, despite the seriousness of the current situation. Refused medevac until the entire team was accounted for. That's Jim, Nate agreed, always putting everyone else first. which is why we needed to put him first today," Rodriguez added quietly. The waiting room fell silent as each man reflected on the bonds that had brought them to this moment, bonds forged through shared hardship, mutual sacrifice, and absolute trust. Their military service might have officially ended, but the covenant between teammates remained unbroken. An hour stretched into 2 as they waited for news. Other families came and went, casting curious glances at the 4 fit, alert men who maintained their vigil with patient discipline. Eventually, Dr. Lawrence appeared in the doorway, still wearing his surgical scrubs, looking tired but satisfied. "Gentlemen," he greeted them as they immediately stood. "Senior Chief Mercer is in recovery now. The surgery was successful, though we did find that his appendix had ruptured shortly before removal." "Complications?" Derek asked immediately, focused on the medical details. "We've started him on powerful antibiotics to prevent peritonitis," Dr. Lawrence explained. "Given the rupture, he'll need to stay for observation for at least 3 to 4 days, possibly longer, depending on his recovery. But barring unexpected complications, he should make a full recovery." The collective relief was palpable, though, subtle, a slight relaxation of shoulders, deeper breaths. "When can we see him?" Nate asked. "He'll be in post-op for another hour, then move to a private room," Dr. Lawrence replied. "You can see him briefly once he's settled, though he'll be groggy from the anesthesia until morning." He hesitated, then added, "I want to apologize for what happened in the emergency department. That's not how we typically operate." "We understand the difference between system failures and individual ones," Nate assured him. "Your intervention likely saved his life." Dr. Lawrence nodded solemnly. "I've known Jim for years, though not as you do. He's been volunteering at the Veterans Center, where I provide free consultations once a month. Always working in the background, fixing things, never drawing attention to himself. I had no idea about his service record until today." "That's Jim," Michael said with a slight smile, "never one to advertise." "Well," Dr. Lawrence replied, "perhaps it's time someone did some advertising on his behalf. This situation has exposed some serious flaws in our protocols, flaws that Dr. Whitman is already addressing. Sometimes it takes an incident like this to force necessary change." As Dr. Lawrence departed, promising to send a nurse when Jim could have visitors, the 4 men settled back into their seats, the adrenaline of confrontation finally giving way to relief. "You know," Rodriguez said thoughtfully, "Jim would hate all this attention. Man's been avoiding recognition his entire career." "Too bad," Derek replied firmly. "Some things need to be seen clearly, even when people try to hide them. Both, the good and the bad. Jim's service deserves recognition, and the failure of the system deserves exposure." Nate nodded in agreement, his expression contemplative. "You know what this reminds me of? That night in Kabul when our extraction got complicated, and Jim insisted on going back for that interpreter's family. Command said it wasn't in the mission parameters, but Jim just looked at me and said, 'Some debts can't be logged in official records.'" Michael finished, remembering the moment. "Doesn't make them any less real." "Exactly," Nate confirmed. Tonight wasn't just about getting Jim treatment. It was about honoring a debt that goes beyond paperwork and protocols. A debt that exists between those who've stood together in places most people can't imagine. The surgical recovery area buzzed with the quiet efficiency of medical professionals tending to patients emerging from anesthesia. Monitors beeped rhythmically, IV lines delivered precise amounts of medication, and nurses moved between beds with practiced precision. In the third bay, Jim Mercer gradually awakened, his consciousness rising slowly through layers of medically induced fog. His first awareness was of the dull, medicated pain in his abdomen, different from the sharp agony he had experienced earlier, but unmistakably present beneath the pharmaceutical buffer. As his eyes adjusted to the dimmed lighting, he registered The presence of someone seated beside his bed. Not a nurse or doctor, but a familiar silhouette he hadn't seen in person for nearly 3 years. "Welcome back," Nate said quietly, noting Jim's return to consciousness. "Surgery went well. Appendix decided to call it quits, but they got to it before things got too complicated." Jim attempted to speak, his throat dry from intubation. Nate reached for a small cup of ice chips on the bedside table, offering one to moisten Jim's parched lips. "How?" Jim managed after a moment, his voice a rough whisper. "How did we find you?" Nate supplied. "Pure coincidence. Or fate, if you believe in that sort of thing. Team reunion at Hastings Lake House. We were headed into town for supplies when Rodriguez spotted your truck in the hospital parking lot." He paused, studying Jim's face. "You look like hell, by the way." A faint smile crossed Jim's pale features. "Feel like it too." He closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. "Heard there was some commotion." "Nothing major," Nate replied with deliberate understatement. "Just a small disagreement about the definition of emergency medical care for veterans." Before Jim could respond, a nurse entered, checking his vitals and adjusting his IV. "Good. To see you awake, Mr. Mercer," she said warmly. "Dr. Lawrence will be pleased. He's ordered you moved to a private room for your recovery." She glanced at Nate. "We're bending the rules a bit, allowing visitors in recovery, but under the circumstances." "Appreciate it," Nate replied with a respectful nod. After the nurse departed, Jim fixed Nate with a more focused gaze, the effects of anesthesia gradually receding. "What exactly happened out there? Last thing I remember clearly was being in the waiting room, trying not to pass out from the pain." Nate considered his answer carefully, knowing Jim's aversion to being the center of attention. "Let's just say we helped the hospital recognize some flaws in their administrative protocols." Jim's expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with the vague response. "Nate, I've known you for 20 years. You don't do anything halfway. What did you and the team do?" Before Nate could formulate a more detailed yet diplomatic response, the recovery room doors swung open again. This time it wasn't a nurse who entered, but a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, wearing a business suit despite the late hour. He approached Jim's bed with purpose, nodding respectfully to Nate before addressing Jim directly. "Senior Chief Mercer," the man began, "I'm Senator Thomas Hartwell, Colorado. I hope I'm not intruding, but when I heard what happened here tonight, I felt compelled to come immediately." Jim looked genuinely confused, glancing questioningly at Nate, who appeared equally surprised by the senator's appearance. "Senator," Nate acknowledged, standing to shake the man's hand. "Commander Reeves, I wasn't aware you were in the area." "Fundraising dinner in Portland," Senator Hartwell explained. "I was just heading back to my hotel when Admiral Holbrook called me." He turned his attention back to Jim. "Senior Chief, I serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and what happened to you tonight is exactly what we've been fighting against in Washington." Jim shifted uncomfortably, and not just from his surgical incision. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this was just a misunderstanding about insurance verification." The senator's expression hardened slightly. "With all due respect, it was far more than a misunderstanding. It was a systemic failure that placed bureaucracy above the welfare of a decorated veteran. A veteran, I might add, whose service record I've had the privilege of reviewing in the last hour." Jim shot an accusatory glance at Nate, who raised his hands defensively. "Don't look at me. I just texted Admiral Holbrook to let him know what was happening. Whatever happened after that was beyond my control." Senator Hartwell pulled up a chair on the opposite side of Jim's bed. "Senior Chief Mercer, I understand your desire for privacy. Admiral Holbrook mentioned your preference for staying out of the spotlight, but sometimes individual cases like yours become important catalysts for necessary change." Jim sighed, wincing slightly at the pain the deep breath caused. "Senator, I appreciate your concern, but I'm just one guy who had an appendix problem. There are veterans with much bigger issues who deserve your attention." "That's precisely why I'm here," the senator countered, "because you're not just one guy. You represent thousands of veterans who face similar barriers to care every day, men and women who don't happen to have a team of former operators advocating for them in the emergency room." Before Jim could respond, the recovery room doors opened again, admitting Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Whitman, the hospital's chief medical officer. They appeared momentarily surprised to find a United States senator at their patient's bedside. "Senator Hartwell," Dr. Whitman acknowledged, recovering quickly, "I wasn't aware you were visiting our facility tonight." "An unplanned visit, Doctor," the senator replied, standing to shake hands, "but a necessary one, I believe." Dr. Lawrence approached Jim's bedside, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. "How are you feeling, Jim? Pain manageable?" "I've had worse," Jim replied, simply. "I'm sure you have," Dr. Lawrence responded with knowing respect. "But you don't need to tough it out here. We have excellent pain management protocols." He adjusted something on Jim's IV. "This should help make you more comfortable without clouding. You're thinking too much." Dr. Whitman cleared his throat. "Senior Chief Mercer, I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable delay in your treatment earlier this evening. I assure you that we are already implementing changes to ensure nothing like this happens again." Jim nodded, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of so much high-level attention. "Mistakes happen. I understand hospital policies can be complicated. Policies should never override medical necessity," Dr. Whitman stated firmly, "especially for someone who has served our country with such distinction." He glanced toward Nate. "Commander Reeves and his team were right to advocate so forcefully on your behalf." Jim raised an eyebrow at Nate. "Just how forceful was this advocacy?" Nate's expression remained carefully neutral. "Proportionate to the situation." "Which is precisely the issue," Senator Hartwell interjected. "The fact that it took the intervention of 4 highly trained special operators to secure basic medical care for a veteran is symptomatic of a larger problem." The recovery room nurse returned, indicating it was time to move Jim to his private room. As they prepared for the transfer, the gathering of distinguished visitors attracted attention from other hospital staff, who whispered among themselves, clearly aware that something significant was unfolding. Within 30 minutes, Jim was settled in a spacious private room on the surgical recovery floor. Despite his protests that such accommodations were unnecessary, Dr. Whitman had insisted, citing medical necessity given the ruptured appendix and potential for complications. The room quickly became an impromptu command center as more visitors arrived. First the other members of Nate's team, then Dr. Erin Martinez, the regional VA director, who had driven directly from Portland after receiving calls from both Admiral Holbrook and Senator Hartwell. As the room filled with increasingly influential people, Jim looked increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. Noticing his discomfort, Nate suggested they take the discussion to the hospital's conference room, leaving only Derek behind to keep Jim company. "You're looking better," Derek observed, once the room had cleared of the high-ranking visitors. Colors coming back. "What the hell is happening, Derek?" Jim asked, his voice stronger now. "I came in with appendicitis and somehow ended up with a senator and a VA director camping out in my hospital room." Derek settled into the chair beside the bed. "Simple version. You got screwed over by a broken system. We objected, loudly. Word. Traveled up the chain faster than we anticipated." "I don't need all this attention," Jim protested. "There are guys with real problems who need this kind of advocacy." "That's exactly why this is happening," Derek countered, leaning forward intently. "Because you're not the only one, Jim. You're just the one who happened to have witnesses who wouldn't stand for it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Remember Ramirez?" Jim's expression darkened. "Of course. What about him?" "After he got out, he had symptoms similar to yours. Went to his local VA clinic. They told him it wasn't urgent, gave him an appointment for 3 weeks later." Derek's voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected old anger. "He died from a ruptured appendix 2 days before his appointment, alone in his apartment." Jim closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the painful information. "I didn't know." "Most people don't," Derek continued. "Just like most people don't know about Martinez waiting 8 months for surgery on a knee he blew out saving 3 civilians. Or Jackson being denied mental health services because some administrator couldn't find his deployment records." He leaned closer. "The system is broken, Jim. Has been for a long time. Sometimes it takes a spotlight on one case to force people to look at the bigger picture." Meanwhile, in the hospital's main conference room, a remarkable gathering had assembled. Senator Hartwell sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dr. Martinez from the VA and Dr. Whitman representing the hospital. Nate, Michael, and Rodriguez occupied one side of the table, while hospital administrators and legal counsel filled the other. The atmosphere was tense but focused, with none of the usual bureaucratic posturing that typically characterized such meetings. "Let me be absolutely clear," Senator Hartwell was saying, his voice carrying the authority of his position on the Veterans Affairs Committee. "What happened tonight represents exactly the kind of failure we've been working to address at the federal level. A decorated veteran with valid benefits was denied urgent care because of administrative obstacles that should never have existed." Dr. Martinez nodded in agreement. "The VA has established protocols for emergency verification precisely to prevent situations like this. The fact that your staff claimed no such protocols existed is deeply concerning." Dr. Whitman looked genuinely distressed. "Since Pinnacle Healthcare acquired our hospital last year, many of our long-standing procedures have been replaced with corporate protocols that prioritize financial considerations. I take full responsibility for not ensuring that these new procedures maintained appropriate emergency exceptions, particularly for veterans." "This isn't about assigning blame to individuals," Senator Hartwell clarified. "It's about identifying and correcting systemic failures. Commander Reeves, from your perspective as someone who witnessed this situation firsthand, what were the critical breakpoints?" Nate considered the question carefully. "3 main issues, Senator. First, hospital staff lacked knowledge of VA emergency verification procedures. Second, medical necessity was subordinated to financial clearance. Third, there was no clear escalation path when policies contradicted patient welfare." The senator nodded, taking notes. "Dr. Martinez, how widespread do you believe these issues are nationally?" "Unfortunately, quite widespread," she replied grimly. "As private healthcare groups acquire more community hospitals, we're seeing increasing reports of veterans experiencing similar barriers to care. Many don't have advocates like Senior Chief Mercer had tonight." "Which brings me to my next point," Senator Hartwell continued. "I believe this incident, while regrettable, presents an opportunity for meaningful reform. Dr. Whitman, would Pinecrest Memorial be willing to serve as a pilot location for a new veteran care integration program we've been developing?" Dr. Whitman straightened, clearly interested. "What would that entail, Senator?" "Direct electronic integration between hospital systems and VA verification databases, mandatory training for all emergency department staff on veteran care protocols, and a designated veteran advocate on staff at all times." The senator leaned forward intently. "In exchange, the hospital would receive federal grants for technology upgrades and staff training, plus prioritized reimbursement for veteran care." The hospital's legal counsel whispered something to Dr. Whitman, who nodded thoughtfully before responding. Conceptually, I'm very supportive. However, as part of Pinnacle Healthcare Group, we would need corporate approval for such a program. Senator Hartwell smiled slightly. I anticipated that concern. That's why I've already spoken with Pinnacle's CEO, Martin Reynolds. He's expecting your call in the morning and has expressed preliminary support, especially given the alternative scenarios. The implied threat was subtle but clear: cooperate with reforms or face public and political scrutiny for the treatment of veterans. The hospital administrators exchanged glances, recognizing both the carrot and the stick being offered. Beyond this individual hospital, the senator continued, I'll be introducing legislation next month to establish these protocols nationally. Commander Reeves, would you and your team be willing to testify before the Veterans Affairs Committee about what you witnessed tonight? Nate glanced at Michael and Rodriguez, receiving subtle nods of agreement. We would, Senator, though I believe Senior Chief Mercer's perspective would be more valuable if he's willing. I'd like to hear from all of you, Senator Hartwell replied. Different perspectives on the same failure provide a more complete picture. He turned to Dr. Martinez. Erin, I'll need comprehensive data on similar incidents nationwide. Can your office compile that within 2 weeks? Already underway, Senator, she confirmed. We've been tracking these cases informally, but this gives us an opportunity to present the findings formally. As the meeting continued, strategies were developed, commitments secured, and timelines established. What had begun as a personal crisis for one veteran was rapidly transforming into a catalyst for systemic change. Throughout the discussion, Nate noticed Dr. Whitman's demeanor shifting from defensive to genuinely engaged, offering insights about hospital operations that could inform more effective policies. After nearly 2 hours of productive discussion, the impromptu summit began to wind down. Senator Hartwell checked his watch. I should visit with Senior Chief Mercer once more before I depart. Commander, would you join me? As they walked back to Jim's room, the senator spoke more personally. You know, my father was a Vietnam veteran, spent his last years fighting the VA for benefits related to Agent Orange exposure, died before his claim was approved. He paused, outside Jim's door. That's why tonight matters to me beyond the politics. Every veteran deserves better than what my father experienced, better than what Senior Chief Mercer experienced tonight. When they entered the room, they found Jim sitting up in bed, looking more alert despite the late hour. Derek had been joined by a distinguished older man in naval dress whites, Admiral James Holbrook, former commander of Naval Special Warfare, and the man responsible for alerting the senator. Jim, the admiral greeted as Nate and the senator entered, was just telling your teammate here about that operation in Somalia. Still classified, of course, so I had to keep it vague. Jim managed a smile. Admiral, didn't expect to see you here, sir. Wouldn't be anywhere else when I heard what happened, Admiral Holbrook replied matter-of-factly. Some things transcend retirement, son. The welfare of my operators is one of them. Senator Hartwell approached the bed. Senior Chief, I'm glad to see you looking better. We've had a productive discussion about changes that will hopefully prevent situations like yours from recurring. Jim shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. Sir, I appreciate everyone's concern, but I'm still not comfortable being the center of all this attention. I understand, the senator replied sincerely, but sometimes the right person at the right moment becomes a catalyst for necessary change. Your experience tonight has already set in motion reforms that will benefit thousands of veterans across the country. The admiral nodded in agreement. Jim, I know you've always preferred to operate in the shadows. That's what made you exceptional in the field. But some battles need to be fought in the open, with witnesses and consequences that can't be denied or buried in classified reports. Jim looked around the room at the extraordinary gathering his medical emergency had precipitated. A United States senator, a retired admiral, former teammates who had dropped everything to stand with him. The weight of their collective concern was almost tangible. "What exactly are you asking of me?" he finally asked. "Your story," Senator Hartwell answered simply. "Your willingness to speak about what happened tonight, not just the failure of the system, but how it was corrected through the intervention of people who refused to accept that failure as inevitable." Jim considered this for a long moment, his natural inclination toward privacy warring with the potential impact his experience might have for others. "Will it actually make a difference?" he asked finally. "Or is this just political theater that fades once the spotlight moves on?" It was Nate who answered, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Jim, you taught me something crucial back in our first deployment together. Remember what you said when that mission in Fallujah went sideways and headquarters wanted us to extract?" A ghost of a smile crossed Jim's face. "Systems don't fix themselves. People fix systems." "Exactly," Nate confirmed. "The people in this room right now, they're system fixers. But they need the ammunition that only your story can provide." Admiral Holbrook added his perspective. "In all my years of command, I've learned that meaningful change rarely comes from reports and statistics alone. It comes from individual stories that cannot be ignored or explained away. Stories that put a human face on systemic failure." Jim's resistance was visibly weakening. "I'm not looking to be anyone's poster boy." "Not asking you to be," the Admiral replied. "Just asking you to be a witness to your own experience. No embellishment, no dramatization, just the truth as you lived it." Derek, who had remained quietly supportive throughout, finally spoke up. "Think about Ramirez, Jim. Think about what might have been different if someone had fought for him the way we fought for you tonight." That reference to a teammate lost, not in combat, but to the very system designed to support veterans, seemed to finally resolve Jim's internal conflict. He nodded slowly, the decision visibly settling across his features. "All right," he conceded. "I'll tell my story for Ramirez and anyone else caught in the same broken system." He fixed the senator with a direct gaze. "But I want your word that this isn't just for show. Real changes need to happen." "You have it," Senator Hartwell promised solemnly. "This isn't about political points for me. It's about honoring a debt we owe to every man and woman who's served." He extended his hand, which Jim shook firmly despite his weakened state. "Your testimony will be the cornerstone of the Veterans Emergency Care Access Act. With your permission, we'll even name a key provision after you." Jim shook his head immediately. "No names. Name it after Ramirez or any of the others who didn't make it through the cracks in the system." The senator nodded in understanding. "As you wish." He glanced at his watch. "I should let you rest. We can discuss the details of your testimony once you've recovered." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Senior Chief, what happened to you tonight was a failure of our promise to those who serve. What your team did in response was a powerful reminder of why that promise matters." As the senator departed, Admiral Holbrook stood as well. "I should go too. Got a breakfast meeting with the Joint Chiefs in Washington tomorrow." He clasped Jim's shoulder briefly. "Proud of you, son. Always have been." Once the high-ranking officials had departed, leaving only Jim and his former teammates, the atmosphere in the room relaxed noticeably. Jim settled back against his pillows, fatigue evident in his features. "So," he said, looking at his four visitors, "anyone want to finally tell me exactly what went down in that waiting room while I was busy not dying?" The four men exchanged glances and Rodriguez grinned. "Well, Nate here basically channeled his inner Captain America, gave this epic speech about honor and duty." "I did not," Nate protested, though a smile tugged at his lips. "You kind of did," Michael confirmed, had the whole waiting room ready to stand at attention. Derek chuckled. Don't forget Rodriguez threatening to tweet about it. That was what really scared them. Jim shook his head, a mixture of exasperation and profound gratitude in his expression. Bunch of dramatic overachievers. Could have just called an ambulance like normal people. Normal is overrated, Nate replied simply. Besides, we made a pact a long time ago, didn't we? No man left behind. That was for combat zones, Jim pointed out. Some battles happen on unexpected fronts, Nate countered. The enemy just wears different uniforms. As exhaustion began to overtake him, Jim fought to keep his eyes open. Thanks, he said simply. The word carrying the weight of everything he couldn't articulate. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Jim's hospital room, casting warm stripes across the sterile floor. It had been 3 days since his emergency surgery, and his recovery was progressing well, despite the complications from his ruptured appendix. The private room that had initially embarrassed him with its special treatment had become an unexpected command center for what Senator Hartwell was now calling the Veterans Care Initiative. Jim adjusted his position carefully, wincing slightly, as he reached for the water glass on his bedside table. Though the worst pain had subsided, the lingering discomfort was a constant reminder of how close he'd come to a much worse outcome. The doctor had explained that peritonitis had begun to develop, and without the surgery when it happened, sepsis would have been a real possibility. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He expected another nurse for the regular vital check, but instead, Sarah, the intake nurse who had tried to help him that first night, entered hesitantly. "Mr. Mercer," she began, hovering near the doorway. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Jim replied, gesturing toward the visitor's chair, "and please call me Jim." Sarah moved to the chair but remained standing, her hands fidgeting slightly with the edge of her scrubs top. "I'm not on shift today. I just wanted to come by and apologize properly for what happened the other night. I should have done more to help you." Jim shook his head immediately. "You have nothing to apologize for. You tried to help within the constraints you were working under." "But it wasn't enough," she insisted, finally taking a seat. "I knew the rules were wrong in that situation, but I was too afraid of losing my job to really stand up against them." She looked down at her hands. "I've been a nurse for 17 years, and somewhere along the way I let policies become more important than patients." Jim studied her for a moment, recognizing genuine remorse. "You called Dr. Lawrence," he pointed out. "That made all the difference." "Too late, though," she replied. "You'd already been suffering for hours by then." "Sarah," Jim said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in the world's most dangerous environments. "In my experience, systems don't change because everyone rebels at once. They change because one person chooses to take a risk, however small, that creates an opening for others to act." He smiled slightly. "Your call to Dr. Lawrence was that opening." She looked up, clearly not having expected forgiveness so readily. "That's generous of you, but—" "It's not generosity," Jim interrupted gently. "It's perspective. I've been in situations where the rules said one thing, but humanity required something else. Those decisions are never easy, especially when your livelihood is at stake." Sarah nodded slowly, a weight visibly lifting from her shoulders. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I wanted you to know that I've accepted a position on the new veteran care response team the hospital is forming. Dr. Whitman asked me specifically because of what happened with your case." Jim raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Response team. It's part of the changes being implemented," she explained, more animated now. "Every shift will have a designated team member responsible for ensuring veterans receive appropriate care, regardless of administrative hurdles. We'll have direct access to VA verification systems and emergency authorization protocols." Her expression grew determined. "What happened to you won't happen to another veteran at this hospital. Before Jim could respond, another knock sounded at the door. Dr. Whitman entered, looking mildly surprised to find Sarah there. "Nurse Jenkins, I didn't realize you were visiting today," he commented. "Just stopping by briefly, Doctor," she replied, standing. "I should go and let Mr. Mercer rest." As she moved toward the door, Jim called after her. "Sarah, thank you for coming by, and for stepping up for the response team." She smiled, nodded once more, and departed, passing Dr. Whitman, who approached Jim's bedside with a tablet in hand. "Your recovery is progressing excellently," the doctor noted, reviewing the most recent lab results. "Dr. Lawrence is pleased with how well you're responding to the antibiotics. If all continues as expected, we should be able to discharge you tomorrow." "Good news," Jim replied. "No offense to your hospitality, but I'd rather be recovering at home." Dr. Whitman smiled briefly. Then his expression grew more serious. "I wanted to update you personally on the changes being implemented following your experience with our emergency department." He pulled up a chair. "With Senator Hartwell's support and guidance from the VA, we're completely overhauling our emergency care protocols for veterans." He turned the tablet so Jim could see a detailed flowchart. "This is our new triage and verification system. Medical assessment now precedes any financial clearance procedures, with dedicated pathways for veteran patients that bypass traditional insurance verification entirely." Jim studied the chart with interest. "Looks comprehensive." "It is," Dr. Whitman confirmed. "We're also establishing mandatory training for all staff on VA benefits and military culture sensitivity." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "The changes at Pinecrest are just the beginning. Senator Hartwell wasn't exaggerating when he said your case has become a catalyst. Pinnacle Healthcare Group, our parent company, has agreed to implement these protocols across all 73 hospitals in their network." Jim looked up sharply, surprised by the scale of the impact. 73 hospitals. Dr. Whitman nodded. "And there's more. 3 other major healthcare groups have reached out in the past 2 days, requesting information about our new protocols. They're eager to avoid similar incidents at their facilities." His expression suggested this eagerness was motivated by both genuine concern and fear of similar publicity. "That's unexpected," Jim admitted, processing the implications. "Sometimes meaningful change requires a perfect storm," Dr. Whitman observed. "A compelling case, the right advocates, and timing that captures public attention." He set the tablet aside. "Which brings me to another matter. There's been significant media interest in your story. Several national outlets have requested interviews." Jim's expression immediately closed. "Not interested." Dr. Whitman nodded, having anticipated this response. "I understand your reluctance. However, Senator Hartwell believes your testimony before the Veterans Affairs Committee would be invaluable in pushing through the legislative changes he's proposing." Jim sighed, remembering his reluctant promise. "I agreed to testify before the committee. That's different from becoming a media story." "Of course," Dr. Whitman conceded. "I'll relay your preference to the senator's office." He stood, preparing to leave. "Oh, and you have more visitors waiting. Should I send them in, or would you prefer to rest?" "Who is it?" "Commander Reeves and—" Dr. Whitman checked his notes. "A Dr. Elena Ramirez." Jim's expression registered surprise at the second name. "Yes, please send them in." As Dr. Whitman departed, Jim adjusted his position, mentally preparing himself for this unexpected visitor. Minutes later, Nate entered, accompanied by a petite woman in her early 40s, with intelligent eyes and a composed demeanor. "Jim," Nate greeted him, "how are you feeling today?" "Better," Jim replied, his attention focused on the woman. "Dr. Ramirez, I presume?" She stepped forward, extending her hand. "Senior Chief Mercer, thank you for agreeing to see me. I'm Miguel Ramirez's sister." "Oh, The name hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding. Miguel Ramirez, the teammate Derek had mentioned, who died from a ruptured appendix after being denied timely care. "Miguel spoke highly of you," she continued, taking the seat Dr. Whitman had vacated. In his letters and during his brief visits home, he always mentioned his team leader who saw the mission beyond the orders. Jim nodded, memories of the young operator flooding back. Miguel was an exceptional soldier and an even better man. His loss. He paused, the words catching. His loss shouldn't have happened. "No," Eleanor agreed, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "It shouldn't have, which is why I'm here." She glanced at Nate, who nodded encouragingly. "Commander Reeves contacted me about what happened to you and about the proposed legislation. As a physician myself and as Miguel's sister, I want to help ensure other families don't experience what ours did." Jim studied her thoughtfully. "What did you have in mind?" "I've established a foundation in Miguel's name," she explained. "Initially focused on supporting families of fallen special operations personnel, but now I'd like to expand its mission to address the gaps in veteran healthcare access, particularly emergency care." Her expression grew more determined. "Senator Hartwell has invited me to testify alongside you before the committee. I believe our combined perspectives, yours as a veteran who nearly became another statistic, and mine as a family member and physician who lost someone to these failures, would create a powerful case for change." Jim considered her proposal, a new dimension taking shape in his understanding of what his experience might accomplish. "You're right," he finally said. "One case can be dismissed as an anomaly. 2 cases from the same unit, with one fatal outcome suggests a pattern that demands attention." Elena's professional composure cracked slightly, relief and gratitude visible in her expression. "Thank you. Miguel always said you understood that some missions continue long after deployment ends." Nate, who had remained quiet during their exchange, finally spoke. "The team and I have been discussing this as well. We've identified 15 similar cases just within our extended network, veterans facing dangerous delays or denials of care because of administrative barriers. 5 resulted in preventable deaths or permanent disabilities." Jim absorbed this information, his tactical mind already analyzing patterns and potential solutions. "We need data, comprehensive, irrefutable evidence that this isn't isolated." "Already underway," Nate confirmed. "Admiral Holbrook has activated his network of retired flag officers. They're gathering cases from across all service branches. Dr. Martinez from the VA is providing internal statistics that have never been publicly released before. And my foundation has medical researchers compiling peer-reviewed studies on outcomes when emergency care is delayed for administrative reasons," Elena added. "We're building a case that can't be ignored or minimized." As they continued discussing strategy, Jim felt something shift within him, the same focused clarity he had experienced during mission planning in his operational days. This was, he realized, another kind of deployment. Different terrain, different adversaries, but the same fundamental purpose, protecting those who serve. Later that afternoon, after Nate and Elena had departed, Jim received another unexpected visitor. Leaning heavily on a cane but moving with determined dignity, former Army Master Sergeant William Torres entered the room. Jim recognized him immediately, not from personal acquaintance, but from the Veterans Center where they had both volunteered, passing each other occasionally with the simple nods of recognition that veterans often exchange. "Master Sergeant Torres," Jim greeted him, genuinely surprised. "Senior Chief," Torres replied with a respectful nod. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Please have a seat." Torres lowered himself carefully into the visitor's chair, his movements suggesting the kind of chronic pain familiar to many who had served in combat roles. "Heard about what happened to you," Thought I should come by, share something you might find useful. Jim waited, recognizing that the older veteran would tell his story in his own time and manner. 2 years ago, Torres began, I had chest pains. While driving home from my grandson's baseball game, pulled into the emergency room at County General, not this hospital, told them I thought I was having a heart attack. He paused, the memory clearly still raw. Desk clerk asked for my insurance card before anything else. When I showed my VA card, they told me I needed to go to the VA hospital instead. How far was the VA hospital? Jim asked, though he suspected the answer. 90 minutes away, Torres confirmed grimly. I told them I wouldn't make it that far. They suggested calling an ambulance, which might expedite my intake at the VA. He shook his head at the memory. I was having a heart attack right there at their desk, and they were worried about who would pay the bill. Jim's expression darkened. What happened? Got lucky, Torres replied simply. Off-duty paramedic was in the waiting room with his kid. Recognized what was happening and raised hell. Created enough of a scene that they finally took me back. He tapped his chest. Triple bypass surgery that night. Doctor said I had what they call the widowmaker. Would have been dead in that parking lot if I'd tried to drive to the VA. The parallels to Jim's own experience were unmistakable, though Torres had been fortunate in ways Jim nearly wasn't. Why are you telling me this? Jim asked, though he was beginning to understand. Torres leaned forward, his eyes reflecting decades of hard-earned wisdom. Because I kept quiet afterward, took my recovery, thanked God for that paramedic, and never made waves. Told myself it was just bad luck, just one bad hospital. He paused, regret evident in his expression. Then last month, buddy of mine from the VFW, Vietnam vet, died in a waiting room at another hospital in this same damn healthcare system. Same story, VA coverage, administrative runaround, died waiting for care he'd earned several times over. He fixed Jim with an intense gaze. Heard you might be testifying before Congress about what happened here. Heard you're reluctant about the spotlight. Understand that completely. But I needed to tell you, my silence 2 years ago might have cost my friend his life. Sometimes standing up and speaking out is as much a duty as anything we did in uniform. The weight of Torres's words settled heavily in the room. Jim nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in them. I appreciate you coming by, Master Sergeant, and for sharing your experience. Torres stood with effort, leaning on his cane. Not just my experience, Senior Chief. It's our experience, all of us who wore the uniform. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn notebook. Started collecting stories after my friend died. 37 accounts so far from vets, in this region alone, all facing the same barriers when seeking emergency care. He placed the notebook on Jim's bedside table. Thought it might be useful for your testimony. After Torres departed, Jim carefully opened the notebook. Inside, in meticulous handwriting, were documented cases, names, dates, hospitals, outcomes. Some noted deceased in red ink, others permanent disability or condition worsened. Page after page of veterans whose service had earned them, care that the system had failed to provide. As he read through the accounts, Jim's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Nate. Turn on the news. Channel 7. Jim reached for the remote control, switching on the television mounted on the wall opposite his bed. The local news was midway through a special report titled Crisis in Veteran Care, System Failures at Local Hospitals. The reporter, standing outside Pinecrest Memorial, was interviewing a familiar face, Sarah, the nurse who had visited him that morning. I've worked in emergency medicine for 17 years, she was saying, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. At being on camera, what happened to Senior Chief Mercer was not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a system that has prioritized financial protocols over patient care, especially for veterans. The report cut to Dr. Lawrence, looking authoritative in his white coat. The dedicated VA line for emergency verification has existed for years, but many hospitals don't train their staff to use it. That's not an oversight. It's a systemic failure that puts veterans at risk. Next came Dr. Whitman, explaining the new protocols being implemented. Then several veterans sharing abbreviated versions of their own experiences with denied or delayed care. The story concluded with the reporter announcing that Senator Hartwell would be introducing new legislation next month aimed at addressing these systemic failures. Jim switched off the television, his thoughts turning to the notebook. Torres had left, to Dr. Ramirez's foundation, to the news report that was likely playing on stations across the region. Something was building, a momentum that had begun with his own case but was rapidly expanding beyond it. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Nate. "Okay to come by? Important update?" Jim texted back his agreement, and within 20 minutes, Nate arrived, accompanied by Derek and Michael. They entered with the easy camaraderie of men who had faced countless challenges together, but there was an undercurrent of excitement in their demeanor. "You saw the news?" Nate asked without preamble. Jim nodded. "Didn't expect it to move this quickly." "That's just the beginning," Michael said, pulling up a chair. "Rodriguez is monitoring social media from the hotel. The story's gone viral. Veterans care is trending nationally." Derek produced a tablet, handing it to Jim. "Senator Hartwell's office sent this. Draft of the Veterans Emergency Care Access Act. They're fast-tracking it based on the public response." Jim scrolled through the document, impressed by its comprehensive approach. The legislation addressed not just emergency verification protocols, but also accountability measures, training requirements, and funding mechanisms to ensure implementation. "This is thorough," he acknowledged. "Turn to page 17, Nate suggested. Jim did so, then paused, reading the section header twice. The Ramirez-Torres provision. The section detailed mandatory acceptance of VA identification for emergency services, with penalties for facilities that delayed care for administrative reasons. They named it after Miguel and Torres's friend, Jim noted, unexpectedly moved by the gesture. "Your recommendation," Nate reminded him. "Senator." Hartwell honored it. Michael leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jim, there's something else you should know. The testimony before the committee has been moved up. Media pressure, public interest. They want to strike while attention is focused on the issue." "When?" Jim asked, tensing slightly. 3 days from now," Nate replied. "They'll arrange medical transport to Washington if you're cleared to travel." Jim considered this, glancing again at Torres's notebook on his bedside table. "I'll be there. Somehow." Derek nodded approvingly. "There's one more thing. Admiral Holbrook asked us to give you this." He handed Jim a sealed envelope bearing the Admiral's personal crest. Jim opened it carefully, withdrawing a single sheet of heavy paper. It was a letter, handwritten in the Admiral's distinctive script. "Jim, throughout my career I've witnessed countless acts of courage, most in combat, some beyond it. What's happening now falls into the latter category. The battle for proper veteran care has been fought in shadows for too long, with casualties mounting in hospital waiting rooms rather than on fields of combat. Your willingness to step forward, now despite your natural aversion to the spotlight, demonstrates the same courage that distinguished your operational career. Some missions cannot be accomplished from the shadows. Some enemies cannot be defeated without exposing them to the light. I've attached a list of names. 27 men and women under my command who died not from enemy fire, but from systemic failures after their service ended. Their stories deserve to be told. Their sacrifices demand accountability. Stand tall when you testify. You speak not just for yourself, but for generations of warriors whose battles continued long after they hung up their uniforms. With respect and gratitude, Admiral James Holbrook, USN, Retadar. Jim read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and returned it to its envelope. His expression had shifted from reluctance to resolve, the same focused determination that had carried him through the most challenging operations of his career. 3 days, he said finally. We have work to do. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of preparation, medical consultations, and strategic planning. Dr. Lawrence cleared Jim for travel with certain precautions, insisting that Derek accompany him to monitor his recovery. Elena Ramirez arrived with a team of researchers who helped organize the growing collection of case studies into compelling testimony. Torres returned with 5 other veterans from the area, each bringing their own stories and connections to expand the network of evidence. By the morning of the hearing, what had begun as one man's medical emergency had evolved into a comprehensive campaign for veteran healthcare reform. The conference room of the modest hotel, where Jim and his team had established their temporary headquarters, resembled an operations center before a major mission. Maps showing healthcare access points across the country, statistics on veteran populations and emergency care facilities, detailed analyses of existing protocols and their failures. Jim stood before the assembled group. His former teammates, Dr. Ramirez, Master Sergeant Torres, and his veteran colleagues, 2 healthcare policy experts Senator Hartwell had sent to assist them, and 3 VA officials who had joined their effort after being granted special permission to testify. "Today isn't about me," Jim began, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once guided men through the world's most dangerous environments. "It's not even about the specific failures that brought us together. It's about fulfilling a promise this country made to everyone who raised their right hand and swore to defend it." He moved carefully to the map, still mindful of his recent surgery. These red markers represent documented cases where veterans were denied or delayed emergency care due to administrative barriers. These blue markers show hospitals that have already committed to implementing the new protocols. Our mission today is to turn those red markers blue, not just through legislation, but through a fundamental shift in how the system views its obligation to veterans. The room hummed with purposeful energy. The disparate group united by a common mission that transcended their individual experiences. "Remember," Jim continued, "this isn't an assault on the healthcare system itself. Most healthcare providers want to do the right thing. This is about removing the barriers that prevent them from doing it." He paused, looking around the room. "In combat, we learned that the most effective operations aren't about overwhelming force. They're about precise application of pressure at key points that cause systems to reorganize themselves. That's what we're doing today." As they prepared to depart for Capitol Hill, Nate approached Jim privately. "You know, when I texted Admiral Holbrook that night at the hospital, I never imagined it would lead to all this." Jim smiled slightly. "Butterfly effect. Small actions, big consequences, just like you taught the new operators." "That was actually your line," Nate corrected. "From that mission in Kandahar when we had to change the entire battle plan because of one unexpected civilian contact." "Was it?" Jim reflected. "Seems like a lifetime ago." "Different battlefield," Nate agreed, glancing toward the assembled group now gathering their materials. "Same principles." As they moved toward the vehicles that would transport them to the hearing, Jim felt none of the reluctance that had initially clouded his agreement to testify. Instead, he experienced the same clear-eyed focus that had characterized his finest moments in service, the absolute certainty that came with knowing a mission was necessary and just, regardless of personal cost. The battle that had begun in a hospital waiting room was about to expand to the national stage. But unlike the covert operations of his military career, This was a fight that required visibility, that demanded public witness. As Torres had said, sometimes speaking out was as much a duty as anything they had done in uniform. For Jim Mercer, who had spent decades in the shadows, stepping into the light would be its own kind of courage. But he wouldn't be stepping alone. Behind him stood not just his former teammates, but a growing army of veterans, healthcare providers, family members and advocates, all united by the conviction that those who had fought for their country shouldn't have to fight for the care they had earned. As their convoy pulled away from the hotel, Jim glanced down at Torres's notebook, now supplemented with dozens of additional accounts gathered over the past days. Each name represented not just a failure of the system, but a potential victory if they succeeded. Each story was a reminder that true service continued long after the uniform was put away. The mission was clear, the team was ready, and this time failure wasn't an option. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.